The American Wild West is one of the most romanticized periods in human history, and almost everything you believe about it is wrong. Cowboys riding into the sunset, brave pioneers taming untamed land, heroic sheriffs in dusty standoffs. These are the foundations of 1,000 movies, TV shows, and Halloween costumes, and they are almost entirely fiction. The real Wild West, the 25 years stretching from 1865 to 1890, was a relentless cycle of disease, economic exploitation, poisonous water, poisonous whiskey, poisonous medicine, and weather events so catastrophic they wiped out entire industries in a single season. The #1 killer on the overland trails was not outlaws, not rattlesnakes, not a dramatic last stand. It was cholera-induced diarrhea, which could kill a perfectly healthy person between breakfast and noon, and it did so by the tens of thousands. What follows is what daily life in the Wild West actually looked like. The food, the water, the money, the medicine, the towns and the travel. And by the end, you are going to feel a deep and personal gratitude for indoor plumbing, refrigerators, and the modern dental industry. Let's start with the most immediate survival question of the era. What exactly were you going to eat? Part 1. The food. Picture yourself as a cowboy in the 1870s, fresh off signing up for a cattle drive from Texas to a Kansas railhead. 2 to 3 months in the saddle, 14 to 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, doing back-breaking physical labor through extreme heat, rain, dust, and mud. The cattle industry has thought carefully about your nutritional needs, and what they've landed on is beans. Dried beans. And if you're lucky, some salt pork, a fatty slab of preserved meat that had to be soaked for several hours before eating, because skipping that step would make you violently ill. Hardtack rounded out the menu, which was a biscuit made from flour, water, and salt, baked until every molecule of moisture had been driven out of it, leaving something closer to a tile than a food. Soldiers during the Civil War soaked it in coffee to make it edible, and cowboys on the trail did the same, which brings us to the one thing everyone agreed on. Coffee was sacred. Arbuckle's brand, specifically, with its beans coated in sugar and eggs, was the single most important item in any trail cook's supply wagon. Here's the thing that surprises most people. Cowboys almost never ate beef on cattle drives, and because those cows were money on the hoof and eating the inventory was frowned upon by the men writing the paychecks. When a calf did get slaughtered for supply reasons, the trail cook made something gloriously named son of a gun stew, built from the animal's heart, liver, tongue, marrow gut, and sweetbreads, which is the historical term for testicles. At branding time, those same testicles got fried separately and served as a standalone dish, a tradition that survives today on menus across the Mountain West under the name Rocky Mountain oysters, served to unsuspecting tourists who are then photographed, realizing what they just ate. Homesteaders on the Great Plains had a slightly different situation, but not a meaningfully better one. Their diet ran heavily on potatoes, beans, rice, cornbread, and soda biscuits, after all slathered in lard or gravy, because fat was caloric currency when you burned thousands of calories daily just keeping the homestead running. Fresh fruit and vegetables were so scarce as to be nearly mythical on the frontier, and citrus was essentially non-existent, which meant scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that makes your gums bleed and your teeth fall out, earned its description as the most common dietary disease on the Oregon Trail. Cooks substituted sheep sorrel leaves for lemon juice. When real coffee ran out, they roasted acorns, dandelion roots, or dried sweet potatoes, and brewed those instead, because the frontier ran on hot caffeinated liquid and everyone adapted accordingly. What a 1889 record from the Espuela Land and Cattle Company is where the numbers get genuinely bleak. Feeding a cowboy cost 14.5 cents per day. That is less than a gumball in modern currency, and that's what the cattle industry decided a human being's daily nutritional needs were worth. And none of that food was safe in any modern sense either. No refrigeration meant constant spoilage. Rain caused mud to fall from sod house ceilings directly into cooking pots, lice-infested kitchens and bedding, and pioneer journals routinely mention being poisoned by spoiled milk. The calorie math made all of it worse. A standard trail ration provided roughly 1,700 calories per day. But men doing 12 to 16 hours of intense physical labor needed between 3,000 and 4,500 calories to function. But they were consistently underfed for months at a time, and this was considered acceptable. Part 2. The water. At least the water was safe, right? No, the water was also trying to kill you, and it was much better at it than the food. The Oregon Trail funneled hundreds of thousands of emigrants along the Platte River, a wide, shallow waterway cutting through the heart of the Great Plains that also served as the primary cholera corridor on the continent. Human and animal waste, garbage, and the runoff from thousands of campsites contaminated the same water sources everyone drank from. And because nobody in the 1840s and 1850s understood how bacterial transmission worked, the connection between contaminated water and mass death kept killing people for decades. Cholera spreads through Vibrio cholerae bacteria, and in the era of the overland trails, its cause, transmission, and treatment were all completely unknown. What emigrants did know was that you could feel perfectly fine at breakfast and be dead before dark. Symptoms started with sudden violent diarrhea and vomiting so severe that victims lost liters of fluid within hours, followed by a bluish-gray discoloration of the skin, a hollowing of the eyes, and a collapse of the face inward as dehydration took hold. Death arrived within hours of the first symptoms in severe cases, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The third cholera pandemic swept the overland trails from 1846 to 1860, and of the roughly 350,000 people who made the journey, disease killed somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000, 9 out of every 10 trail deaths. Over the full span of Western emigration, historians put the total at up to 65,000 dead along the overland routes, which works out to roughly a grave every 50 yards from Missouri to Oregon City. Emigrant Cecilia McMillan Adams kept a diary that reads like a ledger of the dead. Past 7 new-made graves, one had 4 bodies in it. Cholera, followed days later by, we have passed 21 new-made graves, and then past 13 graves today. She counted graves the way modern travelers count mile markers. And cholera was not the only water problem. Central Wyoming's stretch of the Oregon Trail ran through water sources so saturated with alkaline minerals that drinking them caused vomiting, convulsions, and death in both humans and animals. One emigrant described the scene at Alkali Swamp near Casper as dead oxen marking all the road, wasn't no mile but offended the nostril with its effluvia. George Kaiser wrote directly to his relatives warning them, "Do not drink water from those cursed pit-holes of deaths, for it is nothing less than that caused all of our sickness." The prescribed treatment for alkali poisoning was vinegar, flour paste, or lard, which managed the symptoms approximately as well as you'd expect vinegar and lard to manage severe poisoning. None of this was helped by climate. The Great Plains ran on a cycle of wet and dry years, and railroad promoters selling land grants aggressively exploited the wet periods by advertising the region as permanently fertile. Northern Pacific Materials described Montana's climate as a cross between Paris and Venice, which was a spectacular and deliberate lie. But when the drought cycle of the late 1880s arrived and ran through 1895, crops died, soil turned to powder, and settlers abandoned their claims in enormous numbers, having built lives on land that never had enough water to support them. Part 3. The weather. January 12th, 1888 started as a warm day. Temperatures sat in the 40s across the northern Great Plains, which felt practically tropical for January, and children went to school without winter coats because the weather seemed to be cooperating for once. Farmers worked in the fields without heavy gear, and then, around noon, a wall of Arctic air slammed into the plains without warning, dropping temperatures from the 40s to below zero in minutes, with winds at 50 miles per hour, and a whiteout blizzard materializing from a sky that had looked almost reasonable that morning. As the schoolhouse blizzard killed approximately 235 people, with some estimates running considerably higher, children were trapped in one-room schoolhouses across the region. Ole Olsen Tilland, a 70-year-old farmer, was found dead just 12 feet from his own front door. A teacher named Ali Etta Shattuck survived the night in a haystack but later died after surgery for frostbite. 17-year-old teacher Minnie Mae Freeman reportedly connected 13 children together to lead them through a half-mile whiteout near Ord, Nebraska, making sure none of them drifted off into the white and vanished. The storm lasted one afternoon and killed hundreds of people who had simply gotten dressed that morning without a heavy coat. The winter before the schoolhouse blizzard, though, is the one that ended an entire industry. But after a blazing hot summer that had already stressed cattle across an overstocked and overgrazed plains, temperatures dropped to between 40 and 63 degrees below zero and stayed there, with blizzards running continuously from November through February 1887. The open-range cattle business, the entire economic model that made the Wild West cowboy a real occupation, collapsed in that single season. Colorado's large-scale cattle companies fell from 58 in 1885 to just 9 by 1888. Granville Stewart, one of Montana's biggest ranchers, lost 72% of his herd. Nelson Story lost 75%. The Poudre Livestock Company watched 2/3 of its animals die, representing $400,000 in losses. Theodore Roosevelt suffered devastating losses in the same event and left ranching permanently, was never recovering financially from the winter he'd trusted the open range. A contemporary observer captured it perfectly. A man froze to death in a light linen overcoat with a flyer in his pocket advertising Kansas as the Italy of America. Before either blizzard, the summer of 1874 had produced a different kind of catastrophe entirely. A swarm of Rocky Mountain locusts descended on the Great Plains that year, estimated at 12.5 trillion insects, covering an area the size of California. They ate crops, obviously, but also clothing, wooden tool handles and leather goods, covering the ground 6 to 12 inches deep in some areas. Kansas newspapers reported they devoured everything green. Prairie fires, also common across the region, moved faster than any horse could run, burning hundreds of miles of grassland in hours. Well, the frontier weather was not an obstacle to be overcome. It was an ongoing negotiation with a force that held all the cards. Part 4. The money. The financial picture of the Wild West is one of its most consistently underrepresented disasters. So let's run the actual numbers. Cowboys in the 1870s and 1880s earned between $25 and $40 per month, with room and board included when working from ranch headquarters. That sounds workable until you convert it. $25 in 1880 equals roughly $780 to $800 in modern dollars, spread across 14 to 18 hours of labor per day, 7 days a week. The math works out to somewhere between $2 and $4 per hour in modern terms, which sits below today's federal minimum wage, and that's for herding thousands of cattle across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain through weather that could kill you. Was eating food that might also kill you, drinking water that was actively trying to kill you. Miners earned slightly more. Hard rock workers pulled about $2 to $2.25 per day in the 1880s, coming out to $60 or $70 per month. But they earned it underground, breathing rock dust that caused silicosis, working near explosive gases that could transform a normal Tuesday into a mass casualty event. The calculation of whether mining paid better than cowboying depends entirely on how you value not dying in an explosion. The California gold rush of 1849 is where the economic mythology gets most aggressive. Yes, some miners in the early placer days could earn $8 to $16 per day, which sounds like real money until you look at what things cost around them. A single egg in San Francisco cost $1. One slice of bread cost $1. Or a pound of coffee ran the equivalent of $1,200 in modern dollars. A pair of boots would set you back the modern equivalent of $3,000. Hotel rooms for gamblers in San Francisco went for the modern equivalent of $300,000 per month. Laundry in San Francisco cost so much that shipping dirty clothes to Hawaii for washing and back was actually the cheaper option. Historians of the period put it plainly. Everybody except the miners got rich. The merchants, the landlords, the saloon keepers, the supply companies, all of them cleaned up. The miners mostly made enough to survive, often barely. And this is where the company scrip system comes in, which deserves recognition as one of the most efficient mechanisms of economic entrapment ever devised. Mining companies in the 1880s began paying workers not in US. A currency, but in company scrip, metal tokens or paper chits redeemable only at the company store, which charged inflated prices for everything. Scrip could be advanced to workers at 50 to 80 cents on the dollar. Workers caught spending scrip at other merchants faced immediate termination. Companies also deducted rent and medical fees directly from wages before handing anything over. As one historical account put it, some company stores made more profit from the stores than the coal from the mine. Tennessee Ernie Ford's song about owing your soul to the company store was not a metaphor. It was a description of how payroll worked. Homesteaders operated under a different set of illusions. The 1862 Homestead Act offered 160 acres for just $18 in total fees, which sounded like the opportunity of a lifetime. And the problem was structural. 160 acres was perfectly adequate for farming in the humid eastern states, and completely, dangerously insufficient on the arid Great Plains, where families needed far more land to support even a small livestock operation in unpredictable rainfall. John Wesley Powell at the U.S. Geological Survey warned Congress about this mismatch repeatedly and specifically. Congress ignored him. Of the roughly 4 million homestead claims filed between 1863 and 1900, only 40% resulted in completed patents. 60% of people who attempted homesteading never successfully proved it up. One Nebraska homesteader wrote, "Not 1 year have we succeeded in making a living off our place." Two financial panics finished off whatever the weather didn't, while the Panic of 1873 put 89 of 364 American railroads into bankruptcy and collapsed 18,000 businesses in 2 years, with unemployment hitting 14% by 1876. By 1890, 71% of the nation's wealth sat with less than 9% of the population. Then the Panic of 1893 hit, silver prices cratered, and Leadville, Colorado watched more than 90 mines close and 2,500 workers lose their jobs in rapid succession. Aspen went from 12,000 people to near abandonment within 18 months. Horace Tabor, once a genuine millionaire mine owner and a real-life Wild West success story, died in poverty in 1899. The American West has thousands of ghost towns. Most of them are the architectural remains of economic catastrophe. Part 5. The towns and the travel getting to the Wild West before the Transcontinental Railroad was a months-long ordeal, and the ordeal started the moment you climbed into, or, more accurately, walked next to your wagon. The Oregon Trail stretched roughly 2,000 miles, and walking it took 4 to 6 months. Most emigrants walked alongside their wagons because riding inside was substantially worse. Covered wagons had no suspension system, only leather strap braces that transmitted every rock, rut, and divot directly into the spine of anyone sitting inside. The interior offered roughly 80 square feet of space for all of a family's possessions and supplies, and trail dust ran 2 to 3 inches deep and fine as flour, getting into eyes, lungs, and food, regardless of what precautions anyone took. In summer heat, wagon wood shrank until iron wheel rims rolled off entirely, requiring travelers to soak their wheels in rivers each night just to keep them intact. Or lips blistered and cracked from the dust and wind, and the only available remedy was axle grease. Stagecoach travel was faster, but designed with minimal concern for passenger comfort. The Butterfield Overland Mail covered 2,812 miles in 25 days, averaging about 4.5 miles per hour, with passengers crammed 3 to a side in facing rows, knees interlocked, baggage on laps, mail pouches at feet, traveling day and night without stopping. A full route ticket cost $200 in period money, which translates to over $3,000 today, for the privilege of arriving at your destination unable to straighten your spine. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, cut New York to San Francisco, travel from 6 months to 7 days, and transformed freight costs by a factor of 10. A building it required 10,000 to 15,000 Chinese laborers working at any given time, comprising 80 to 90% of the Central Pacific's workforce, paid 30 to 50% less than white workers for the same jobs. They blasted through Sierra Nevada granite using nitroglycerin, worked in avalanche conditions, and endured summer desert temperatures reaching 120 degrees. No official death records were kept, and historians estimate approximately 1,000 to 1,200 Chinese workers died during construction. At the Golden Spike ceremony that celebrated the railroad's completion, nobody mentioned them. What you found at the end of any journey west was typically not much to look at. Most frontier towns were built almost entirely of wood, which on the treeless Great Plains meant settlers started out in sod houses, buildings cut from blocks of prairie grass and root systems stacked into walls. Cool in summer and warm in winter, sod houses also leaked mud directly into food every time it rained, which was a significant design limitation. Dugouts carved into hillsides were the other option. Mining towns started as tent camps, became wooden shacks, and occasionally evolved into something resembling permanent structures before the mine played out and everyone left. Sanitation was essentially a concept that had not reached most frontier towns. No running water, no closed sewers, unpaved streets, mixing animal waste and garbage into the mud and dust through which everyone walked. Bathing was considered medically suspicious by a substantial portion of the population, with the prevailing belief being that washing removed protective oils necessary for healthy skin. Cowboys on cattle drives shared a single wash basin. Full baths were a rare event. Bunkhouses used old newspapers as wallpaper, both to seal out wind and to provide reading material, a combination of insulation and entertainment that cost nothing and worked about as well as you'd expect newspaper walls to work. Part 6. The Medicine. Before going further, here is one sentence that should reshape how you think about the entire era. Many frontier doctors simply declared themselves physicians and set up practice because no licensing requirements existed in most Western territories until the late 1800s. Texas established the first physician licensing board in 1873. Before that, and in most other territories well past that date, the primary qualification for practicing medicine was owning some equipment and being willing to try. Frontier doctors often couldn't earn a living from medicine alone, so they also farmed, preached, pulled teeth on the side, and accepted payment in produce or livestock. Treatment frequently happened in patients' homes or on a quickly cleared table in a saloon, which also served as the operating room, the waiting room, and the recovery ward. What passed for treatment included mercury compounds used as purgatives, quinine for fever, opium for pain, turpentine and vinegar for infections, and whiskey for everything else. Joseph Lister published his carbolic acid antiseptic method in 1867, but adoption was slow enough that many surgeons were still operating in blood-crusted coats without gloves well into the 1880s. while rinsing instruments in water that hadn't been boiled between patients. The Texas Medical Association's own account of the era states that a patient had about as much hope of surviving with medical attention as without it. That is not editorializing. That is a medical organization describing its own profession's historical limitations. Patent medicines filled the gap, and they were spectacular frauds dressed in confident packaging. These products were called patent medicines, despite not being patented, a legal technicality that meant no ingredient disclosure was required. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed specifically for babies and infants who needed calming, contained morphine. Bayer sold heroin over the counter, marketed as a non-addictive cough suppressant. Clark Stanley's snake oil liniment contained mineral oil, capsaicin, turpentine, camphor, and beef fat, but no actual snake oil, a detail that somehow makes the product worse rather than better. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 finally required that dangerous ingredients appear on labels, meaning that for the entire Wild West era, anyone buying medicine had no legal right to know what was in it. And then the dentistry, which deserves its own section in any catalogue of historical suffering. Dentists were not common on the frontier until the 1870s, and before that, tooth extractions were performed by barbers and blacksmiths using pliers, forceps, or a device called a turnkey that used the patient's jawbone as a lever and commonly dislocated the jaw in the process. Whiskey administered in large quantities was the only available anesthetic. By age 50, the average frontier citizen was completely toothless, the result of rampant decay driven by sugar, alcohol, tobacco, and the near-total absence of dental hygiene. Entire families or towns shared a single toothbrush. Toothpaste didn't exist until 1873, and people substituted baking soda, salt, or campfire ash. Untreated dental infections carried a 40% mortality rate because bacteria spreading from an abscessed tooth to the jaw, throat, and bloodstream was fatal without antibiotics, which wouldn't exist for another 60 years. Some people responded to these odds by having all their teeth pulled preemptively, and this was considered, without irony, a thoughtful gift for a newly married bride. Doc Holliday, the gambler of Tombstone, the man at the OK Corral, was a licensed dentist. He graduated in 1872. He moved west partly because dry air was recommended for his tuberculosis, and the dental practice he tried to establish never fully took off, which is perhaps the most understandable career pivot in Western history. Part 7. The Guns. Almost everything you believe about Wild West gunfights comes from Hollywood, and almost none of it maps onto what actually happened. Yale historian John Mack Farragher has stated directly that the quick-draw duel, two men facing each other in a dusty street, hands hovering over holsters, one draw settling everything, almost never happened. The Hickok Tut shootout in Springfield, Missouri, on July 21, 1865, is recognized as the first documented quick-draw gunfight in American history, and it's famous specifically because it was so unusual that people wrote it down. Real frontier violence ran toward drunken brawls, sudden arguments, and ambushes. Or the cinematic fast-draw holster is a Hollywood invention. Real cowboys carried pistols tucked into belts, pockets, or waistbands. Accuracy was generally poor. Multiple shots were fired at close range, and bystanders took bullets regularly. Bank robbery numbers tell a similar story. University of Dayton historian Larry Schweikart documented fewer than a dozen bank robberies across 15 frontier states from 1859 to 1900, and his summary is direct. There are more bank robberies in modern-day Dayton, Ohio, in a year than there were in the entire Old West in a decade. Banks sat in town centers surrounded by armed citizens with a direct financial stake in stopping any robbery, which created a deterrent that Hollywood consistently forgot to film. The outlaws themselves, checked against the actual historical record, also shrink considerably. As Billy the Kid's legend claims 21 kills, one for each year of his life, and historians put the real number at 9 deaths total, 4 solo killings, 5 as part of a group. Jesse James, Across all his raids and robberies, only one killing can be, as historians put it, 100% pinned on Jesse, the murder of conductor William Westfall during the 1881 Winston train robbery. Butch Cassidy, described by historians as certainly not a bloodthirsty killer, went through his entire career of bank and train robbery without killing anyone during a robbery, with one possible exception. These are the men whose legends built an industry of violence. And here is where the mythology collapses most completely. Many Wild West towns had stricter gun control laws than most American cities operate under today. To Dodge City's first law upon incorporation in 1878 banned carrying firearms within town limits, with a sign at the city limits reading, "The carrying of firearms strictly prohibited." Tombstone required visitors to surrender firearms upon arrival. UCLA law professor Adam Winkler has noted that Tombstone had much more restrictive laws on carrying guns in public in the 1880s than it has today. The most common arrest in many cattle towns after drunk and disorderly conduct was carrying a firearm illegally. The gunfight at the OK Corral, the founding event of the entire Wild West mythology, happened because the Clanton and McClory Cowboys refused to comply with Tombstone's gun ordinance, and Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday came to enforce it. The whole thing lasted 30 seconds. 3 men died. None of it looked like the movie. And the gun that killed more immigrants on the overland trails than any outlaw ever could was the one accidentally discharged by someone in the wagon next to yours, because wagons were rolling arsenals of rifles, pistols, lead, and gunpowder carried by people with no formal training. Conclusion: step back and look at what the Wild West actually was. 25 years from 1865 to 1890. The cattle drive era that defines most of its mythology ran perhaps 20 years total, and ended permanently with the winter of 1886 to 1887. The cowboy, as a real occupation, represents a single generation of workers, a substantial percentage of whom were black or Mexican, nearly all of them earning wages that fall below today's minimum standards, eating food that barely met caloric minimums, drinking water with a meaningful chance of killing them, by seeing doctors who carried roughly equal odds of helping or harming them, and living in wooden or sod structures with no sanitation, no refrigeration, and no anesthesia. Life expectancy at birth hovered around 40 years during this period. Infant mortality ran roughly 175 to 225 deaths per 1,000 births, compared to 5.4 today, a 97% reduction. 1 in 6 American infants died before their first birthday around 1900. Maternal mortality sat at approximately 850 per 100,000 births, compared to roughly 23 today. The math in every category is staggering. The Census Bureau declared the frontier officially closed in 1890, and the frontier hadn't been tamed so much as exhausted by overgrazing, by drought, by economic panic, by disease, by the relentless arithmetic of a continent that did not accommodate the way it was being settled. Hollywood took this complicated, frequently tragic 25-year period and filtered it into something clean and heroic. The lone cowboy, the righteous marshal, the great open land waiting for someone brave enough to claim it. The reality was that you were probably going to die of cholera somewhere along the Platte River, or get your jaw dislocated by a blacksmith who was also your dentist, or lose your entire cattle herd in a February blizzard, or spend 20 years farming land that received half the rainfall you needed and end up with nothing to show for it but the claim notice. But the movies looked incredible, and the mythology held, and here we are. If this video left you genuinely grateful for antibiotics, municipal water treatment, dental anesthesia, and the legal requirement that medication labels tell you what's actually inside, then it did its job. History is always more interesting and more sobering than the story that replaced it.